Have you ever wondered if your donations really make a difference? Imagine the shock of a millionaire discovering the truth behind the walls of the church, where he has always made generous offerings. In today's video, you will follow the story of Fernando, a wealthy businessman who disguised himself as a beggar to discover how his money was being used. What he found was more shocking than anyone could have imagined. Prepare for a revelation that will touch your soul, stir your emotions, and open your eyes to the true face of charity. Don't miss this opportunity to see the raw and unfiltered truth and learn valuable lessons about authenticity and generosity. Stay with us and discover what Fernando revealed and how it could transform the way you view your own acts of charity. Check if you're already subscribed to my channel and help me bring more stories like this. Fernando Alves was a name that echoed through the elegant streets of the city. Known as one of the most successful and generous businessmen in the region, he lived in a majestic mansion on top of a hill, with breathtaking views of the urban horizon. His life seemed to be the dream of anyone. A top-of-the-line sports car in the garage, a priceless art collection adorning the walls of his home, and a lifestyle that exuded luxury and sophistication. Every Sunday, Fernando made it a point to attend St. Raphael's Church, an imposing place with colorful stained glass windows and architecture that spoke of centuries of tradition. He not only attended but was also one of the church's largest donors. People spoke of his generous contributions with admiration. From church renovations to funding social programs for the less fortunate, Fernando seemed to be the very embodiment of charity and benevolence. During church events, Fernando was always the center of attention. He was greeted with warm smiles and pats on the back. The members of the congregation, especially the church leaders, were always by his side, thanking and praising him for his generosity. The public recognition of his donations made him feel like a true hero, a model of success and altruism. But behind the golden doors of his mansion and the camera flashes capturing his smile for magazine covers, there was a life filled with pressure and expectations. Fernando was constantly praised for his good deeds, but his true motivation for giving had not yet been revealed. He knew that his donations helped many people, but something inside him began to question. Was all the money he contributed really reaching where it was supposed to? In the solitude of his luxurious office, Fernando began to hear rumors about the questionable use of church funds. People were talking about discrepancies and financial reports that didn't seem to align with the church's public image. These conversations unsettled Fernando, and a growing doubt began to haunt his mind. He wondered if the true spirit of charity he believed he was nurturing was, in fact, being corrupted. So on a quiet night, with a starry sky and the city below looking like a sea of lights, Fernando made a decision that would change his life. He decided to look beyond the surface and see for himself what was really happening at the church he had supported so much. But he didn't want to be recognized. To do this, he needed to disguise himself, making himself invisible to those who knew his face as a successful businessman and philanthropist. Thus began a journey of discovery that would reveal more than he could ever imagine. Fernando, the millionaire, was about to enter a world he had never known, and the truth he sought was about to be unearthed. Motivation for the disguise. Fernando Alves had always been known for his generosity and good heart. From a young age, he had believed that true wealth was not measured merely in material goods, but in the ability to help others. However, his belief that his donations were making a difference began to crumble when he started hearing unsettling rumors. It all started with a casual conversation at a social event. Between toasts, an old friend of Fernando mentioned something that initially seemed like insignificant gossip. "Did you know that things at the church aren't as transparent as they seem?" said the friend, his tone laden with doubt. The statement went unnoticed at the time, but over the days, more people began to raise the same question. Reports of community members who felt ignored or mistreated began to reach Fernando. Fernando's curiosity turned into unease. He knew the people at the church and had an idealized view of the positive impact of his donations. The idea that something could be wrong with the institution he so deeply respected troubled him profoundly. He began to investigate discreetly, examining financial reports and talking to staff, but nothing seemed to indicate clear irregularities. The unease persisted, like a shadow that wouldn't dissipate. During a sleepless night, sitting in his office lit only by the soft light of a desk lamp, Fernando reflected on what he had heard. He was far from an impulsive man. But there was something in the reports that didn't add up. His desire to understand the truth grew, fueled by the idea that those who truly needed help might not be receiving what they required. He then made a bold decision. To discover what was really happening inside the church, he needed to see things from a different perspective. It wasn't enough to be present as a distinguished donor. He needed to infiltrate in a way that allowed him to observe the internal workings without being recognized. The only way to do this was to disguise himself. Fernando began to plan his disguise meticulously. He knew he needed to be convincing. In a small workshop at a second-hand clothing store, he chose torn and dirty clothes, items that could transform a sophisticated businessman into an ordinary beggar. Each piece of clothing was carefully selected to ensure that his disguise was as authentic as possible. He also created a new identity, João, a beggar who was going through difficulties and seeking the church's help. The preparations for the disguise were not only physical but also mental. Fernando had to mentally prepare for the experience, placing himself in the mind and heart of someone living on the streets. It was an emotional and psychological challenge, but he was determined. His donations and efforts had always been guided by a genuine desire to help, and he felt that the only way to protect that desire was to ensure that the help truly reached those in need. With the plan set and the disguise ready, Fernando was prepared for the next stage of his journey. With each step he took toward the church, a mix of anxiety and determination accompanied him. He knew he was about to enter a world he did not know well, and what he would find could forever change his view of the church, and even his life. Preparations for the disguise. Fernando Alves knew that his plan to infiltrate the church needed to be perfect. Any misplaced detail could raise suspicion and jeopardize his mission to uncover the truth. With his mind focused and renewed determination, he immersed himself in the preparations for the disguise with meticulous care. The first step was to find the right clothes. Fernando did not want merely to look like a beggar. He wanted to embody the role so that no one could distinguish his true identity. He began his search at a second-hand clothing store. The thrift shops, with their piles of old and worn clothes, were the perfect place to find what he needed. He spent hours examining each item. Torn, stained, and dirty clothes were essential to create an authentic look. Fernando selected an old jacket, its fabric faded and frayed at the edges. The pants were even more deteriorated, with noticeable holes in the thighs and legs. To complete the look, he found a battered hat that seemed to have weathered many storms, and a dirty shirt with dark stains that appeared to have years of accumulated grime. As he selected each piece, Fernando imagined how each item would help him blend in. He even bought a pair of worn-out shoes, with soles nearly disintegrated, and an old, torn bag to carry what appeared to be his life reduced to a few essential items. With each choice, he ensured that the final appearance was convincing enough to blend in with the real beggars he would encounter on the street. The next step was to create a new identity. Fernando wanted a common name, one that wouldn't draw attention, and João seemed perfect. He thought of all the details for his new persona. João was a man who had fallen on hard times, someone who once had hope and dreams but now lived in dire conditions. To give life to this new identity, Fernando wrote a brief backstory about João, describing how he had lost his job and home due to a series of unfortunate events. With the disguise complete and the identity created, Fernando spent considerable time rehearsing his role. He practiced walking in a way that revealed a slight weariness, a movement that conveyed a sense of exhaustion, and an invisible weight on his shoulders. He also worked on his facial expression, learning to show a mix of resignation and hope in his eyes, a look that seemed to reflect the harsh reality of life on the streets. To ensure there would be no mistakes, Fernando decided to perform a test run. On a cold morning, he donned the disguise and went for a short walk around the city. He passed through different areas, observing how people reacted to him. The test was not easy. Fernando felt the discomfort and vulnerability of being in someone else's shoes, but it was essential to adjust any details that might compromise his mission. With everything ready, Fernando felt a mix of nervousness and anticipation. The disguise was perfect, and João's identity was well defined. He knew that by entering the church with this new look, he would be stepping into a world he did not know well, and the truth he sought could be more impactful than he expected. It was a bold step toward a revelation that could change everything he thought he knew about the church and about himself. Arrival at the church. Fernando, now in the guise of João, the fictional beggar, prepared for the most crucial part of his mission. With the disguise complete, he wore his tattered jacket, ripped pants and battered hat. His bag, filled with rags and a few worn-looking items, was slung over his shoulder. The sky was overcast and a light drizzle began to fall, adding a somber touch to his challenge. He approached St. Raphael's Church, an imposing building with its Gothic facade and large wooden doors standing like sentinels. The church's towers, adorned with golden crosses, seemed almost to watch over the city, and the grand entrance, always majestic, now seemed like an obstacle for João. As Fernando neared the entrance, he felt a flutter of nervousness. There was something surreal about seeing that sacred place from such a different perspective. He knew that, to the church members and clergy, he was just another face in the crowd of beggars who sometimes passed through the door. Fernando approached the church's main entrance, his mind filled with mixed expectations and a dose of anxiety. The sound of the church bells chimed softly, and the organ music blended with the murmur of attendees. The setting he knew so well, with its marble-clad walls and benches arranged in impeccable order, now seemed distant and almost inaccessible. He entered the church, pushing through the large doors with a slight push. The difference in how he was received was immediate and painful. What was usually a place of welcome and reverence now felt like a hostile space for him. Heads turned to look, but there were no recognitions or welcoming smiles. The warm reception Fernando used to feel when entering was absent. He walked slowly down the central aisle, his gaze scanning the details around him with a sense of urgency and strangeness. The benches, usually occupied by families and individuals in prayer, were now filled with people who ignored him. He tried to approach some of the congregation members, people whom, under different circumstances, he knew by name and who treated him with cordial sympathy. Fernando noticed that, instead of smiles and words of encouragement, people looked away as if he wasn't there. Their eyes, which once shone with gratitude and reverence, were now fixed on the ground, as if his presence was an inconvenience. Some church members murmured among themselves, casting disdainful glances at the beggar who dared to enter that sacred space. Meanwhile, the church staff, known for their cordiality and attentiveness, passed by Fernando with a cold indifference. They chatted animatedly among themselves, not even sparing a glance at João. Fernando tried to ask for a little help, a simple gesture of compassion, but his attempts were met with dry and evasive responses. The clergyman, Father Carlos, who had always recognized and praised him for his generous donations, was busy talking with some important members of the congregation. When Fernando approached, hoping for at least some acknowledgement or a word of comfort, the priest didn't even bother to look at him. Instead, he continued his conversation, giving orders to the staff and adjusting details for a future event. The feeling of being invisible and disregarded was unsettling. Fernando began to feel like a stranger in a place he had always considered a spiritual home. Every step he took inside the church seemed to echo louder, and the contrast between how he was treated as Fernando and how he was ignored as João was painful. With a heavy heart, Fernando found a discreet place to sit. He observed what was happening around him with a mix of disillusionment and frustration. What he had expected to find was an environment of help and love, but instead he found an institution that seemed to fail in its own promises of charity and compassion. The weight of his discovery was beginning to become clear. What was supposed to be a simple visit had turned into a journey of shock and disillusionment, and the truth he sought was about to be revealed in a way he never imagined. Observations and discoveries. As Fernando, disguised as João, settled into a discreet corner of the church, he tried to absorb every detail around him. The soft light filtering through the stained glass windows cast intricate patterns on the marble floor, but the warmth and welcome he knew were absent. Instead, the atmosphere seemed coated with a layer of coldness and indifference. As João observed, the contrast between his expectations and the reality unfolding before him was increasingly shocking. He saw a group of beggars, similar in appearance to him, approaching the altar in search of some form of help. With tattered clothes and faces marked by the harshness of life, they approached with a mix of hope and despair. The first beggar, an elderly man with a patched hat and a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, was approached by one of the church staff. Fernando watched closely, noting how the staff member, a young man in a dark suit, spoke to him in a cutting and impersonal tone. The beggar tried to explain his situation but was interrupted with a brusque gesture. "Get out of here. We don't have time for you," was the harsh response he received. Fernando felt a lump in his throat at the sight of the helpless expression on the beggar's face. With each interaction, the sense of discomfort and sadness deepened. He saw another beggar, a young woman with a baby in her arms, trying to approach a table where food and clothes were usually distributed. She extended a trembling hand, hoping for any help. But the woman at the table, dressed in an elegant party dress, looked at her with visible disdain before moving the table away, as if her presence was a nuisance. The staff members whom Fernando knew as welcoming and caring figures now showed a different side. They chatted casually among themselves, as if the presence of the beggars was a mere distraction amidst their daily tasks. Instead of offering a smile or a word of comfort, they treated them with a coldness that seemed a natural part of their job. Fernando saw a group of church members, chatting animatedly near the main entrance. When a beggar approached, they quickly stepped away, as if trying to avoid contact. Their posture was clearly hostile, and their conversations quieted as soon as the beggar got closer. The whispers and glances that followed the beggar were laden with judgment. The scene that shocked him the most was the reaction of Father Carlos himself, who approached a beggar sitting alone, leaning against the church wall. Fernando expected the priest, known for his supposed kindness, to offer some form of support or comfort. Instead, the priest walked past the beggar without even glancing at him, his face expressionless, as if the beggar was nothing more than an obstacle in his path. Fernando felt a deep sadness upon realizing that the welcome and charity he believed the church represented were being denied to those who needed them most. He felt a weight on his heart, a mix of frustration and disillusionment. The church, which had always been a symbol of generosity and love to him, now revealed a dark side he had never imagined. As João observed, the revelation of how the promised help was often denied deepened. He saw the true nature of the treatment given to the beggars and realized that the generous donations he had made seemed to have no real impact. The pain and indignation he felt were palpable, and the mission he had undertaken to uncover the truth was becoming a painful and revealing journey. With a heavy heart and a new understanding of what really happened within the walls of that church, Fernando prepared for the next step. The shock of the discoveries was only beginning to unfold, and what he would do with this new truth could have much greater implications than he had imagined. Meeting with the priest, while Fernando, disguised as João, tried to process the coldness and indifference he had witnessed in the church, he knew he needed to confront a central figure in the church's administration, Father Carlos. The priest was known for his reputation of kindness and generosity, and Fernando hoped that, at least he, could offer some understanding or help to those in need. Fernando mentally prepared himself for the encounter, taking a deep breath and adjusting his worn-out hat. The feeling of discomfort and frustration was growing, but he remained determined to seek an answer. He knew that the truth was within his reach, and Father Carlos could be the key to understanding what was really happening in the church. The priest was in a reserved corner of the church, away from the curious eyes of the attendees. He was engaged in conversations with a few important members of the congregation, discussing details about upcoming events and plans. Fernando approached cautiously, his heart racing with expectation and anxiety. As he got closer, Fernando noticed that Father Carlos was dressed in an elegant robe, his expression serious and focused. He was in the middle of an animated conversation with two church members, both impeccably dressed. Fernando hoped that by interrupting the conversation, the priest would demonstrate an attitude of welcome and solidarity, in line with the stories he had heard about him. Fernando made an effort to approach, his heart pounding. In a hesitant voice, he tried to get the priest's attention. "Father, sir, could you help me? I am going through a very difficult time and need a little help." Father Carlos looked at Fernando with an expression that quickly became impassive. He gave João a brief glance, and instead of offering a word of comfort, he made a vague gesture with his hand, as if trying to dismiss Fernando's presence. "The church is very busy today," the priest said, in a distant and almost hurried tone. "Perhaps you can find what you need elsewhere." Fernando felt a tightness in his chest. What he had hoped would be a moment of understanding and support turned out to be a superficial and discouraging encounter. As the priest continued his conversation with the members, Fernando saw that his indifference was not just a fluke but seemed to be a common practice. The priest treated those in need as an inconvenient interruption, not as people who deserved attention and compassion. Fernando watched how the priest dealt with others who approached with similar requests. Each time the response was the same: a quick look, an impersonal gesture, and an almost automatic dismissal. The priest, whom Fernando had always seen as a beacon of charity, now revealed himself as someone who used his position to maintain a facade of kindness without truly engaging with those in need. There was a young woman with a baby in her arms who approached Father Carlos with a look of desperation. Fernando saw that instead of offering a listening ear or some form of concrete assistance, the priest quickly dismissed her with an impersonal gesture and a perfunctory excuse. The woman, with tears in her eyes, left the church with the same hope she had entered with, now shattered by the indifference she encountered. Fernando felt a wave of disillusionment. What was once a church full of promises of help and love now seemed to be a cold, bureaucratic structure where words of kindness did not translate into real actions. The revelation of how Father Carlos and other church leaders dealt with the needy was a harsh blow to Fernando, who had always believed in the sincerity of the institution. With a heavy heart, Fernando decided to leave. The feeling of having been deceived by something in which he had placed so much faith was overwhelming. He realized that the true face of the church was far from what he had imagined, and that the help he thought was being offered was actually a facade to maintain a public image. As Fernando walked away, the pain of disillusionment mixed with a new determination. He knew he needed to share what he had discovered, that the truth needed to be revealed, not just for him but for everyone who believed in the charity and goodness of that institution. And so Fernando's journey was just beginning, with the certainty that the truth, no matter how harsh, needed to be told. Disenchantment with the church. Fernando, still disguised as João, walked through the church with a growing sense of disenchantment. The temple, which he had always considered a bastion of charity and hope, now revealed itself to be a place where words of compassion often did not translate into actions. Every step he took seemed to echo with the resonance of disillusionment. As he observed, Fernando noticed a series of behaviors that completely contradicted the values of love and help that the church preached. The church was full of people, all dressed in their finest Sunday clothes, chatting animatedly about the latest news and social plans. However, the same attention was not given to those who truly needed it. He saw a group of church staff in an informal conversation, with a clearly disinterested attitude. They laughed and discussed trivial matters, while outside the church, beggars and homeless people sat silently, waiting for any kind of assistance. The contrast between the warmth of the internal conversation and the coldness of the abandonment outside was shocking. Fernando noticed how the church office doors were always closed to those who tried to ask for help. There was a sign that read "Public Service" at the entrance, but often, the response to those knocking was a furtive glance and a "Sorry, we can't help now." He realized that this was not an exception but a common practice. A particularly striking moment was when a young man, with an urgent expression, asked for help for medical treatment he could not afford. He approached the service desk, where a staff member listened to him with an impatient look. She coldly explained that the church had limited resources and that he should seek help elsewhere. The young man, with tears in his eyes, walked away without receiving any real guidance or support. The most disappointing behavior came from the church members themselves. Fernando observed several of them, who normally seemed so warm and generous, completely ignore the needy around them. When a beggar approached a group of well-dressed people who were talking about a fundraising event, he was met with suspicious looks and murmurs of disdain. As the beggar tried to get closer, he was politely dismissed, with a gesture indicating that he did not belong in that environment. The scene that touched Fernando the most was that of an elderly woman, with a tattered blanket around her shoulders, trying to sit on the few chairs available in the church's outer area. One of the church's security guards, with an impassive look, approached her and in a harsh manner asked her to leave. "This is not a place for you," he said, without offering an alternative or a word of consolation. The woman, with an expression of pain and confusion, slowly stood up and walked away, leaving Fernando with a lump in his throat. Fernando felt as if he had been struck by a deep blow. The image of the church that he had carried for so long was crumbling before his eyes. The place he had seen as a refuge for the needy a symbol of kindness and solidarity, was revealing a cruel and indifferent side. He felt a wave of sadness and anger as he realized that the support and charity promised were far from being a reality. With each moment of observation, Fernando felt his disenchantment deepen. The church, which should have been a beacon of hope, was revealing itself as a place where good intentions were often replaced by inhumane and disinterested practices. The realization that the institution did not live up to his expectations of love and support was a hard blow, and the weight of disillusionment was almost unbearable. Fernando knew that this journey of discovery was not just for his own understanding, but to bring to light a truth that needed to be revealed. He realized that the facade of charity and compassion was being maintained through a carefully constructed image, while the reality for those most in need was very different. With a sense of urgency and determination, Fernando prepared himself to carry the truth forward, aware that change had to begin with the revelation of the truth. Confrontation with the truth. Fernando, still in the guise of João, was deeply shaken. The discouragement he felt after days of observing the church was turning into a firm determination. He knew he had to do something, and that something was to reveal the truth. The church, which he had once considered a bastion of hope and charity, was being unmasked as a place where generosity was merely a facade. The discrepancy between the church's public image and the harsh reality he had witnessed needed to be exposed. With a racing heart, Fernando decided to confront Father Carlos. He knew this would be a crucial moment, and that he had to be careful to ensure his message was clear and impactful. He headed to the priest's office, where he had seen the priest before, and took a deep breath. The sound of his boots echoed through the silent corridors as he advanced with renewed determination. Upon reaching the office door, Fernando hesitated for a moment, his heart pounding. He knew this would be the moment of truth, a direct confrontation with the church's leadership. With a firm gesture, he knocked on the door, and Father Carlos's voice invited him in. The priest was seated at his desk, reviewing some documents when Fernando entered. He looked up, surprised to see a beggar in his office. Without recognizing Fernando, the priest made an effort to hide his surprise and maintain his composure. Father Carlos, Fernando began, trying to keep his voice firm and clear. "I need to speak with you." Father Carlos nodded, signaling for Fernando to continue. With a gesture of disdain, Fernando removed his tattered hat and adjusted his ragged clothes, revealing who he truly was. The priest looked shocked, and an awkward silence filled the room. "I am Fernando," he said, "one of the church's biggest donors. I disguised myself as a beggar to discover what really happens with the money I donate here. And what I saw horrified me." Father Carlos, stunned, tried to process the revelation. Fernando continued, each word laden with the pain and frustration he felt. He detailed how he had witnessed the church staff's indifference and the lack of real support for those in need. He described the cruel and apathetic treatment he had observed, the way the truly needy were ignored and treated with disdain. "I saw people being expelled," Fernando continued, "or ignored, even when they were desperately asking for help. The generosity the church preaches is a facade. The money you and others raise is not going where it is truly needed. It is being used to maintain a public image, while those who really need it are left behind." Father Carlos, initially shocked, tried to defend himself. "You must have only seen a small part. Our mission is to help everyone, but we face limitations and challenges. Sometimes we don't have enough resources." Fernando interrupted, his voice heavy with a mix of frustration and sadness. "It's not just about limitations, Father. It was about humanity, about empathy. I saw with my own eyes the unwillingness to help, the way the needy are treated as a nuisance. The reality is that the promised help never arrives." As the conversation continued, some church members, drawn by the commotion, approached the room. Fernando observed them, knowing this was the moment of truth. He wanted everyone to see and understand what was being revealed. The confrontation was not limited to Father Carlos. Fernando decided to speak with other members of the congregation who were nearby, exposing the discrepancy between the church's public image and the internal reality. The atmosphere was tense, and the looks of surprise and discomfort were evident. The reactions were varied. Some members seemed perplexed and ashamed, while others tried to justify or downplay what was being revealed. However, The impact of the confrontation was undeniable. Fernando's words, filled with pain and indignation, were planting a seed of doubt and reflection. Fernando felt a wave of relief mixed with sadness. He had faced the truth and exposed the discrepancy he had discovered. His journey of discovery and the revelation of his identity had been crucial moments, and he knew that the battle for the truth was just beginning. As he prepared to leave the church, Fernando looked back, seeing Father Carlos and the church members engaged in a heated discussion. The reality he had unveiled was beginning to unfold, and the hope that the truth might lead to real change was now a spark he had ignited. The road ahead would be difficult, but Fernando was determined to continue his mission to expose the truth and fight for justice. Repercussions and subsequent actions. Fernando's revelation was like a stone thrown into a calm lake, creating ripples that quickly spread throughout the community. The uproar was immediate and profound. The news that one of the church's largest donors had disguised himself as a beggar to expose the cruel and indifferent reality he had witnessed spread like wildfire. Reactions were intense, ranging from shock and outrage to a sense of betrayal. In the first few days after the revelation, the community was divided. Some people were furious about what they had learned, while others were skeptical, struggling to accept the disconcerting reality Fernando had exposed. Phones rang incessantly, social media was flooded with discussions, and local newspapers couldn't stop reporting the story. Fernando, though initially feeling vulnerable, began to realize that his courage had sparked a necessary change. The news of the church scandal dominated the headlines. Reports of outraged people demanding answers became a constant in public conversations. The pressure was mounting, and it was impossible to ignore the urgent need for a response. With the situation spiraling out of control, the church leadership, led by Father Carlos, had no choice but to act. The initial response was an attempt to minimize the damage. The priest made a public statement, apologizing and promising that an investigation would be conducted. He tried to calm the situation by asserting that the church was committed to truth and justice. However, the community was not satisfied with mere words. Criticism of the church's administration was so intense that public pressure forced concrete action. In response to the popular outcry and demands for transparency, the church announced the formation of an independent commission to investigate the institution's practices and finances. This commission would be composed of respected community members and external auditors, ensuring that the investigation would be impartial and thorough. The investigation process began quickly. The audits revealed the extent of the problem, confirming many of Fernando's allegations. Records of unaccounted donations and the misappropriation of funds intended for charitable projects were found. The revelation that many funds were not being used to help the needy, as had been promised, generated widespread feelings of betrayal among church members and the community at large. As the results of the investigation became public, the church leadership faced a wave of severe criticism. Father Carlos and other leaders were forced to respond to the accusations and endure intense scrutiny. The community's shock and outrage led to swift changes. Some of the church's management practices were immediately reformed, with new policies implemented to ensure more transparent and accountable administration. The church began working on a reform plan, promising a new system for managing donations and greater engagement with the needy community. Aid programs were reviewed and, in some cases, completely restructured to ensure that resources truly reached those in need. Additionally, the church committed to providing regular financial reports and establishing a direct communication channel with donors, ensuring greater transparency and trust. Fernando, who had initially been a controversial figure, began to be seen as an agent of change. Although the process had been painful, his courageous action brought to light the need for a fairer and more transparent system. He was invited to participate in community meetings and discussion forums, contributing his perspective to ensure that the transformation would be genuine and lasting. The impact of Fernando's revelation extended beyond the church walls. Other leaders and community organizations began to reassess their practices, inspired by Fernando's bravery. The change was not limited to the church but sparked a broader movement for transparency and social responsibility in charitable institutions and non-profit organizations. As the dust settled, Fernando observed the transformation with a mix of relief and gratitude. He knew that the battle for truth was not over, but the response and subsequent actions showed that his courage had triggered significant change. The truth had been revealed, and the community was now on a path to rebuild trust and restore the values that the church had promised to uphold. Lesson and final reflection. After the storm of revelations and changes, Fernando found himself in a moment of deep reflection. Sitting in his office, looking out over the city through the large window, he revisited every step of his journey with a mixture of emotions: relief, sadness, and a newfound understanding of philanthropy and faith. The experience he went through was an emotional roller coaster. From the moment he decided to disguise himself as a beggar to the shocking revelation of the church's practices, each step taught him a profound lesson about the nature of charity and authenticity. Now, with everything that had happened, Fernando found himself needing to share his conclusions. He began to reflect on the true meaning of charity. For Fernando, charity was not just about making generous donations, but about the real impact these actions had on people's lives. He realized that true charity is not just about giving, but ensuring that what is given truly benefits those who need it most. And most importantly, charity must be accompanied by a genuine commitment to the well-being of others. As he pondered everything he had discovered, Fernando was particularly shocked to realize the contrast between what the church preached and what it actually practiced. The public image of generosity and compassion that the church projected was far from the reality experienced by the most needy. For Fernando, this was not just a disappointment but a wake-up call for the need for greater integrity and transparency in institutions that receive public support. On a clear and sunny afternoon, Fernando decided to share his experience with the public, using his platform to convey his reflections. He organized a series of lectures and community events where he told his story openly and sincerely. He spoke about the lessons he had learned, emphasizing the importance of being authentic and transparent in all charitable actions. "I've learned that true charity isn't just about the act of giving, but about how that act is carried out," Fernando said in one of his lectures. "It's easy to make a donation and feel good about it, but what really matters is whether that donation is genuinely helping those in need. True philanthropy requires more than just resources. It demands a genuine commitment to change and the well-being of others." Fernando also spoke about how his view of faith had changed. He realized that faith shouldn't just be about attending temples or making financial contributions. For him, true faith is demonstrated through concrete actions and real care for the people around us. He emphasized that faith should be a guide for living ethically and compassionately, not a facade to cover up questionable practices. Fernando's words resonated with many. The community, once shaken and divided, found new motivation to reevaluate their own practices of charity and faith. Institutions began adopting more transparent measures and promoting a culture of accountability. With a new perspective, Fernando continued to be an advocate for authenticity and integrity in philanthropy. He worked in partnership with various organizations to ensure that donations truly reached those in need, and dedicated himself to educating others about the importance of transparency and genuine charity. The impact of his journey was profound and lasting. It not only helped reform the church but also inspired a broader change in how people perceive and practice philanthropy. Fernando's experience showed that, although the truth may be difficult to face, it has the power to bring about significant and positive changes in society. Thus, Fernando concluded his reflection with a sense of peace. He knew that, despite the challenges and difficulties, his decision to confront the truth had made a positive impact and promoted greater integrity in charity. His story became a powerful reminder that, in the end, true wealth lies not in money but in the authenticity and kindness we can offer to others. Fernando's journey from a wealthy donor to a humble observer of the harsh realities within a church reveals a powerful truth. True charity goes beyond mere donations. It requires genuine care, transparency, and commitment. His story, marked by a revealing experience and courageous actions, highlights the need for authenticity in philanthropy and faith. If you found Fernando's journey as engaging and enlightening as I did, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge, inspire, and reveal the hidden truths of our world. Click the like button to support our mission of uncovering real stories and shedding light on important issues. Share this video with friends and family to spread the message of true generosity and transparency. And leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on Fernando's story and how it impacted your view of charity and faith. Let's continue this conversation and make a difference together.